The night was alive with the glow of chandeliers and the soft hum of classical music. A luxury mansion stood tall against the skyline, its grand entrance buzzing with high-profile guests stepping out of sleek black cars. Inside, crystal glasses clinked, laughter filled the air, and an endless array of gourmet dishes adorned the tables, each plated to perfection, crafted by world-renowned chefs. Everything screamed elegance, perfection, and, most of all, wealth. But amidst this extravagance, a man in a simple black suit stood quietly near the corner of the lavish banquet hall. He wasn't dressed in designer brands, nor did he carry himself with the usual arrogance of the ultra-rich. Instead, there was an air of quiet confidence about him, like someone who had nothing to prove. This was Ryan Carter, a self-made millionaire, yet completely different from the other wealthy guests around him. He wasn't here to show off his money or flaunt his success. No, tonight was about something else. Tonight, Ryan was putting his humble cooking to the ultimate test. Few knew this side of him. Before the wealth, the luxury, and the million-dollar investments, Ryan had once been a struggling cook, learning to make simple yet heartfelt meals in his small apartment kitchen. Cooking had been his escape, his passion. And even though life had taken him far from those days, he never forgot the joy of creating something meaningful with his own hands. But this wasn't just about nostalgia. This was a challenge. Instead of hiring a Michelin-starred chef or catering company, Ryan had personally prepared a few dishes for this high-class event. He had slipped them onto the buffet table among the gourmet selections, careful not to reveal their origin. There were no fancy plating techniques, no exotic ingredients, just honest, home-cooked meals made with heart. Would anyone even notice? Would these wealthy elites, used to dining at the finest restaurants, appreciate something so simple? Or would they turn their noses up at it, dismissing it without a second thought? He watched as guests filled their plates, completely unaware of his experiment. His heart pounded slightly as he waited, observing their reactions. Some picked at their food absent-mindedly, others took polite bites before moving on to more lavish selections. And then it happened. Someone stopped mid-bite. Their expression shifted. A subtle change, but Ryan caught it. A woman, elegantly, dressed in an expensive evening gown, set down her fork and stared at the dish in front of her. A deep frown formed between her brows. She took another bite, slower this time, more intentional. Then she turned to the man beside her and whispered something. He, too, tasted the food. His eyes widened slightly. Ryan's pulse quickened. Had they figured it out? Were they disgusted? Intrigued? Would this be the moment his humble cooking either triumphed or was torn apart by the judgment of the rich? And just as the tension built, just as Ryan leaned in slightly to catch their reaction, a voice from behind him spoke. "You didn't actually think you could sneak your food in here unnoticed, did you?" Ryan turned sharply. The voice was deep, smooth, calm, yet laced with something unreadable, and when he saw who it was, he realized this night was about to take an unexpected turn. Ryan's breath hitched for just a second, but he quickly masked his reaction. He turned to face the man who had spoken, instantly recognizing him. James Whitmore, a billionaire investor, known for his ruthless business strategies and an eye for detail that never missed a thing. He was the kind of man who could read a room within seconds, picking up on things most people overlooked. And now, his sharp gaze was locked directly onto Ryan, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Ryan forced a casual smile. "I'm not sure what you mean." James chuckled lightly, swirling the wine in his glass. "Come on, Carter. You don't think I'd recognize something different on that buffet table? I know exactly what's being served at my events." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying challenge in it. Ryan felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his face neutral. "And what do you think is different?" James took his time before answering. He glanced at the elegantly dressed guests, still unaware of the silent conversation happening between them. Then he took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never, leaving Ryan's. I think someone decided to conduct a little experiment tonight. Someone who wanted to see how a room full of people obsessed with luxury would react to something humbler. Ryan remained silent, waiting. James leaned in slightly. What I don't understand is why. Ryan exhaled softly, debating how much to reveal. But before he could respond, movement from across the room caught his attention. The woman, who had first reacted to his dish, was now speaking with a group of guests, gesturing toward the table. The man beside her, who had also tasted it, looked equally intrigued. They weren't disgusted. They were interested. Ryan turned back to James. "Because I wanted to prove something," he said simply. James raised an eyebrow, urging him to continue. "I wanted to see if people who've spent their lives chasing luxury could still recognize something real when it's right in front of them." James studied him for a moment, then let out a low chuckle. "That's quite the gamble." Ryan crossed his arms. "Maybe, but sometimes simple things leave the biggest impact." James didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the crowd. More guests were trying the dish now, whispering among themselves. Some took cautious bites, expecting nothing special, only to pause, their expressions shifting as they processed the flavors. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the waiters, a young man who had been clearing empty plates, hesitated before picking up a dish that still had a few bites left. Thinking no one was watching, he grabbed a fork and tasted it. His reaction was immediate. His eyes widened in surprise. Then, after a moment, he took another bite. Ryan saw it. So did James. "Interesting," James muttered under his breath. Ryan felt a flicker of satisfaction. This wasn't just about the rich anymore. Even the staff, people used to working these events, surrounded by expensive meals they could never afford, were reacting to the food. James turned back to Ryan. "All right, Carter, let's say your little experiment is working. What's your next move?" Ryan hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had expected either quiet dismissal or complete failure. He hadn't expected intrigue, and he definitely hadn't expected what happened next. A man's voice suddenly rose above the soft chatter. "Who made this?" The room went silent. It was the man from earlier, the one who had first reacted to the dish. He stood now, looking around, waiting for an answer. Ryan's heart pounded. James smirked. "Well, Carter, you wanted to see how they'd react. Now what?" Ryan swallowed hard. He had wanted an answer, but now all eyes were turning, searching. And soon they'd find him. This was no longer just an experiment. Now it was a moment of truth. Ryan felt every muscle in his body tense as the room fell into silence. The man's question still hung in the air. Who made this? And now more guests were looking around, murmuring. Some nodded in agreement, intrigued by the dish that had quietly disrupted the evening's predictable luxury. Others simply watched, waiting for someone to step forward. James glanced at Ryan, his smirk deepening. "Well," he said under his breath. Ryan's heart pounded. He could lie, stay silent, let the mystery hang in the air. But something about this moment, seeing people react, seeing them care, made him realize that this was more than just an experiment. He cleared his throat and took a step forward. "I did." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some guests looked surprised, others skeptical. The man who had spoken turned to Ryan, studying him. "You?" Ryan nodded. "I made that dish." His voice was steady, even though he wasn't sure what would happen next. A beat of silence passed. Then, the woman who had first tasted the food, the one who had paused, truly tasted it, spoke up. "It's different from everything else here," she said, setting down her fork. "It's real." A few guests nodded in agreement. Others exchanged glances as if unsure what to think. The man who had called out narrowed his eyes slightly. "And you're telling me that you, a millionaire, made this?" His voice wasn't accusatory, but it carried a note of disbelief. "Why?" Ryan took a deep breath. He had asked himself that question 100 times before deciding to go through with this. But now, standing here, the answer was clearer than ever. "Because I wanted to remind people that good food isn't about expensive ingredients or fancy techniques," he said. "It's about heart, about making something that means something. I started from nothing. Before I had money, before any of this, I learned to cook because it brought people together. And I wanted to see if, in a place like this, surrounded by luxury, people could still recognize something made with real care." Silence. Then, to his surprise, the man let out a quiet chuckle. "Well," he said, setting down his napkin, "I don't know much about your reasons, but I do know this. That was the best thing I've eaten all night." A few people laughed softly. The tension in the room shifted. Then another voice spoke up. "He's right." It was an older gentleman near the back of the room. "Everything here is flawless, but this was memorable." Ryan exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected this. He had braced himself for rejection, for amusement, maybe even embarrassment. But this felt real. James, standing beside him, folded his arms. "Looks like your little experiment paid off," he murmured. Ryan glanced at him. "Maybe." James studied him for a moment, then grinned. "You know, Carter, you might be on to something here. People don't just want luxury, they want connection, and tonight you gave them something they didn't expect." Ryan thought about that. He hadn't planned for anything beyond this moment. But now, a new thought took shape in his mind. Maybe this wasn't just an experiment. Maybe this was something more. As the evening carried on, conversations shifted. People still enjoyed their wine, their music, their luxury. But every now and then, Ryan caught glimpses of them talking, sharing, connecting over something as simple as a plate of food. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something deeper than success. He felt purpose. As he walked out onto the mansion's terrace, looking out over the city lights, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.